Nutrient-rich compost. Don't throw away that food waste, make it compost. What to do with that apple core? Be compost. Eat it and just put it where it all goes. Compost.
Save your scraps, save your scraps. Don't put them in the trash. Save your scraps, save your scraps. To the earth they go right back. Save your scraps, save your scraps. And put them in a pile. If that's a no-go, then go to a food scrap drop-off site and smile.
Oh, I love that video. Today we'll be talking about compost, specifically what it is, how it works, why it's important, and some methods of composting. So we'll start with what is it? According to UC Cooperative Extension, compost is a biologically active material that results from the microbial decomposition of organic matter under controlled conditions. So we form a pile made from organic materials, leaves, droppings, dead animals, and water, adding water, and decomposers and microbes break down all that organic matter. And the nutrients that were once in that organic matter, like nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, and others, are now held in the bodies of those microorganisms until they die. Specifically, bacteria like the ones that are eaten by this rotifer here, or by the paramecium, or also fungi. They both are very high in nutrients, so nutrient dense that when an organism like the one you're seeing on the screen eats one, there's just too much nutrients and they have to poop out the nutrients, and they poop it out in a plant available form, a form that a plant can absorb, a salt. And so plants need nutrients to survive. So some people might say, wait, I thought plants make their food through photosynthesis. Yes, they do. That's how they get their energy. Energy like carbohydrate energy that powers them, that gives them energy to grow. The leaves, the shoots, when we eat plants, we're eating carbohydrates. So yes, a lot of the plant is made from carbohydrates or carbon, but it also needs these other minerals to function properly. And so that's why it needs to call on or partner with microorganisms to function properly. And so what the plant does is it takes these extra carbohydrates that it generated through photosynthesis, and it leaks them out through the roots. And it will leak them out in different forms to attract different types of microorganisms. So, I illustrate this by showing different types of cakes and cookies, but really, this type of cookie will attract this type of microorganism. This type of plant sugar will attract another type of microorganism that will give the plant the specific nutrients it's looking for. So the plants, as far as I understand and as we understand, the plant's in control to a degree. And so when certain microbe that mines nitrogen is attracted to the plant root, and then after it dies, those nutrients can be absorbed by the plant root. And so those microorganisms are bringing nutrients to the plant. Fungi will bring water to the plant. And also when invader microorganisms, plant pathogens show up, the beneficial microorganisms that would be in this root zone, the rhizosphere, they protect the plant by producing antimicrobials to tell those pathogens to get lost. And so these are some of the benefits that microorganisms bring and that compost brings to soil and plant health is disease suppression, and also, just giving the plant the nutrients it needs. Does anyone happen to know, in terms of nutrients that they provide to plants, what do synthetic fertilizers and microorganisms in compost have in common? Both are salts. Both provide salts. except that synthetic fertilizers are applied in quantities so high that over time kill microorganisms. The rate, and that's what I'm showing on the left and on the right. The rate of synthetic application, not even the plant can absorb it all. So much of the nutrient is washed into the watershed where it concentrates at carcinogenic levels, also causing toxic algae blooms and eutrophication. Using synthetic fertilizer is like spraying a fire hose of nutrients at a plant, where compost delivers nutrients like a slow dripping tap. And this is another benefit of compost, to make nutrients available at rates that plants require. So microorganisms build soil aggregates. That's one of the funny things about bacteria and fungi, is that they tend to glue themselves to the surfaces of the foods that they're eating. So bacteria will plaster itself onto some mineral, like a clay particle, and it will glue itself there. But because it has this bacterial glue, it kind of pulls along other soil particles, and they all start sticking together, and a group of bacteria will clump a bunch of soil particles together with their glues. And so that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the little brown section. That would be like a little soil particle. And then you'll notice that some of these soil particles, the brown sections, they look like cookies in the picture on the right-hand side of the screen. They are also kind of brought together, and they're brought together by fungi. So I showed you a mushroom on the left with a lasso. They kind of grow around various soil aggregates and lasso them together, forming a macro aggregate. And the benefit of that is that these macro aggregates, they create pore spaces so that the soil is tilthy, and air and water can fill those air pockets, or like those pore spaces. So this is a soil aggregate. Aggregated soil particles form a structured soil. So when it drains, when it rains, when it rains, it absorbs water like a sponge, like what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen. But soil without aggregation is often compacted, like you see on the left. You see like a soil compaction on the top. And as it rains, water runs off the surface. It cannot soak in too well. And when it builds up on the surface and runs off the surface, it can cause floods, and it will pull soil with it, causing erosion, and that could eventually lead to desertification. So those were two benefits of compost, that they not only build soil structure, which increases the water holding capacity, but can increase root depth, but it can retain the nutrients by reducing that runoff. So sorry, I accidentally went forward to the next slide too soon. So compost is an important part of soil building at the farm. It can turn dirt into soil. And I want to draw your attention to the pie chart. What are the differences you see on those charts between dirt on the left and soil on the right? So the differences between dirt and soil, you'll notice, dirt has it has 1% organic matter, less organic matter, it has less air and less water than soil does. And so what's creating, like, why is there more air and water in soil? Well, the more organic matter you have, which is compost, is a form of organic matter you can add to your sand, silt, and clay, you'll be able to hold more more air and water. And then there's some other comparisons I have in here, like dirt is usually the color of the rocks that make it up. So they could be kind of gray. They could even, all sorts of colors. They could be kind of red. But when you add organic matter to that dirt, it starts turning more brown. Specifically, according to Elaine Ingham, who coined the term soil food web and who a lot of my information comes from, 70% cocoa brown color. is the color you'll start getting with soil, because that's kind of the color of the organic matter that she approves of when we make compost. But also, dirt kind of blows away in the wind like it did during the Dust Bowl. It erodes, as we discussed just the last slide. But it can also harbor plant pathogens and support weedy species. But soil, like, it can support a larger variety of plant species, and it's home to beneficial microorganisms that we happen to eat. And then also it holds water, reduces desertification. So now I want you to share with somebody, or just say it out loud, from everything we just learned, like, what was the most interesting benefit to compost that was more memorable to you? Okay, we'll move on to methods of composting. So there are, so many methods of composting. Even more that I've listed here. And some of these methods aren't technically even the full composting method, but they're kind of part of it, or they create a similar product. And we'll discuss some of them. And then if you have any questions about others, you could always put them in the chat or the comment section below. So thermophilic hot composting. What does that look like? So as we see a gentleman here. This is a hot compost pile. Some of the requirements, or the things that define it, are that you will maintain the pile between the temperatures of 131 degrees and maybe 160. Some people change those numbers a little bit, but 131 has generally been the baseline. I heard recently that Michigan State University might have suggested 135 as a better number, like to go no lower than that. So it's got to be maintained with heat, and you've got to add moisture to it. That's most compost. It's got to be made of 50% greens, 50% browns generally. My piles are 60% browns, 30% greens, and then 10% super hot greens, which would be like manures or blood, weird stuff. Gets really hot. Seeds like corn kernels get really hot. And then he's aerating the pile. So that's another very important aspect, is to introduce oxygen. Now, why? Oh, and what are some of the benefits? Well, the major benefits of this specific type of composting is that it kills pathogens, pests, and weed seeds. Pathogens cannot live supposedly above 131 degrees, or at least like 80% of them or more. Pests like fly larvae or something. I mean, think about it. We really do need bugs, and they are decomposers. So we are going to have some bugs in the compost, but maybe we won't have the types of, maybe the compost pile won't harbor the types of pests that we don't want. This is a common phrase that Elaine Ingham has given: kills pathogens, pests, and weed seeds. It will kill the pest eggs. So like if you had a plant that had spider mites and you wanted to compost that material, well, this process will kill, it should kill any of those pest eggs. So I think that's the idea. But you are still going to probably, when the compost pile cools back down, you'll probably get slugs again. You will definitely have cockroaches in there. You'll definitely have beetles, but generally they're predatory beetles. And so they're actually your friends. And you are going to need a little bit of everybody at the table. You are going to need your competitors, because if they're not there, then the good bugs, as we like to call them, the predatory bugs, they're not going to have a food source. So that was a lot to say, but you'll still see some, but maybe not in huge numbers. And then weed seeds. So this is very specific to this type of composting. There are other forms of composting that do not get hot, and they do not kill weed seeds. You know, it's very likely that there are some other methods that kill weed seeds, like anaerobic methods that become super acidic, but cool methods do not. So if you make a cold compost pile, which you just kind of like stack materials and turn it every 6 months, and you don't really monitor heat, those will not kill weed seeds generally. So, I mean, bugs eat seeds, so a few of them will get eaten, but they're generally more weedy when you don't have a hot pile. So that's the benefit of a hot pile. Hot piles, another thing you should know about them, one reason you might want to make one, or one requirement to make one, is that you need a lot of material. So here you're seeing quite a few buckets and containers of material. When I build a hot pile, I use 50 5-gallon buckets of material. And so if you don't have that much yard waste and manures and wood chips, then you might not want to do a hot pile. But also think about all this material. Like that's going to be a lot of work. So you also kind of have to be able to turn all those materials because the pile has to be made all at once. Another thing you might notice about this picture is that there's a diversity of materials. So I like to use a diversity of manures, a diversity of plants, a diversity of wood chips and dead carbonous material, like lots of leaves and different types of leaves, because I believe that there's strength in diversity. And I'm still have a lot to learn, but that's what Elaine Ingham said as well. So I just kind of follow her recipe and I slowly get a feel for it myself. So now, the feedstocks that you saw, they weren't sitting out for very long. 3 days max is what I've been told and what I practice and what seems to work for me, because rotting feedstocks result in the nutrients. Remember we said that there's nutrients in that organic matter and decomposers will break it down. Well, if I just leave a bunch of rotting food scraps in a bucket, they're going to start smelling really bad. And those smells are the nutrients off-gassing. So instead of staying in the material, they're blowing off into the air. And I don't want that. I want to keep the nutrients in the compost. So when should you make a thermophilic hot compost pile? Well, if you have enough feedstock volume and you have access to water, and if you have a pitchfork and you don't need a container to put it in, but I really like to, but it's not necessary. You could even make a pile on the ground. But 50% greens, 50% browns is the general mixture. And you need your effort. You need to be able to turn that pile, give it some aeration. And you need the time to do that, which would be like, probably if you're doing it by yourself, it might take up to 3 hours to build that initial pile, to collect all those scraps and chop them up. Hopefully you have a wood chipper. If not, hopefully you can chop really fast. You can use a flat shovel and really chop those greens in a wheelbarrow. And then you have to be able to, you have a thermometer and you're monitoring temperatures. And so that's when you would, if you have all those conditions, that would be a great time to make hot thermophilic compost. And then the other benefit is, like, you get this compost that's really, Jesse Frost, he's a market gardener in Kentucky, and he's a YouTuber. He would say, he would call this an inoculating compost. And that's a compost that it's like super, I don't know if you'd call it high quality, but the purpose of it, you don't use it in large quantities anywhere, because you couldn't possibly make that much in large quantities unless you had a really expensive windrow turner. So, and that might not even be as high quality as this hand-turned pile that you're seeing in the picture. So this pile could be made into what they call a compost, like a drench or a tea, a compost extract or a tea, and you could, or a slurry as some people might call it, and you could inoculate larger piles that you didn't make as carefully with this compost. Or you can also use it as a tea to cure fungal pathogens on plants. So I had some powdery mildew that and peach leaf curl that I've cured using this method of composting into a tea. And then, of course, you can make it on a large scale. And maybe you would partner. When would you do that? Like if you're partnering with restaurants and community gardens, or maybe you're at a community garden, you're partnering with restaurants or waste management and tree trimmers to get all their waste. Um, and you could build larger piles. You'd probably need a front loader and a windrow turner, or even just a front loader to turn these piles if you're doing them large scale. So next is, let's see, what is next? I have a video. Oh, this is that windrow turner I was telling you about. This one's a little bit less expensive. So at that price, that windrow turner is probably about $5,000. It attaches, and he has it attached to a tractor, which is another, $8,000 at least if you're buying it used, to 12,000. So at that price, why not use another method of composting that I didn't mention about the thermophilic composting, but another reason you might use it is that it is it is one of the methods accepted by organic certification, the National Organic Program. And so that's another reason to use a hot composting method. But why, at that price, why use the thermophilic method when you could also use the aerated static pile? And what that is you'll see there on the right bottom corner, there's a little jumpy house pump. So you can get those for not too expensive, and it's connected to perforated pipe. And then an individual would build a compost pile on top of that pipe, just like what you saw with the thermophilic pile. So this is also a thermophilic pile, except it has a different name because it's static and it's aerated, but not by you or by a machine, mechanical labor. It's aerated by that jumpy house pump. And so you actually do not have to turn it. That was the whole reason that the pile needs to be turned, is that you need to keep air in the pile, to keep the pile aerobic, to keep the beneficial microorganisms alive. And so in this scenario, you build the pile, you let it sit for 3 days only, 72 hours at above 131 degrees or higher, ideally. And then you can just let it sit and cure and break down over a couple months. And that one will turn into compost as well. And it's accepted by the NOP standards. So when would you make an ASP? If your site has access to electricity, or if you're able to power that air pump somehow. If you have a medium amount of material, like 250 gallons of yard waste, that's the 55-gallon buckets, and you're able to build like a 3 cubic yard pile or larger, because you need to have at least 1 cubic yard, 3 cubic feet. And if you have a large, or you could just build a larger pile that you don't need to turn with a windrow, and that one, but you'll have to have a lot of effort up front. Like if you're loading that pile, building that pile with like wheelbarrows and pitchforks, that still might take a few hours. But otherwise, it can just sit there, mature, and then you can use it as needed, even with the wheelbarrow. Or if you have a front loader, that could be an easier way to spread compost too. But not necessary. I spread compost at the farm. We have a half acre of space with row crops, and I use wheelbarrow. It takes a while, but with multiple people, it's doable. Okay, next. There we go. How to make a static aerated windrow pile. So we're going to see Jesse Frost, I mentioned him, making one. He's got the jumpy house pump, the perforated pipe, and he's using his wheelbarrow. to build on top of that. Voila, hot compost. Okay, so now we'll move on to vermicompost. When might you make vermicompost? I like to make it because it can be done in very small spaces. So this is a little more accessible for people who don't necessarily have a yard. You only need 1 square foot of, well, I guess probably about a cubic foot of space or a square foot of space, and then add the height of your worm bin, however tall it is. But I've seen some pretty small ones, so if you have a micro farm and you just want to make that more inoculating compost, as we saw in the first, well, actually the first and second examples, those are both could be inoculating composts because they're thermophilic. So worms are special. Something interesting about them is they're kind of wet. I don't know if you notice, they're kind of slimy, and the slime on their skin has beneficial bacteria in it, and also their guts. Their gut has beneficial bacteria, and they're like the opposite of us. We eat clean food and we poop out kind of dirty stuff with sometimes pathogens in it. And worms, they can eat pathogens, and then their beneficial gut microbes destroy those pathogens, and then they poop out clean poop. It's probably cleaner than our mouths. So worms act very much like the thermophilic compost in that way. The only main difference is that you'll get a lot of seeds in vermicompost or vermicast. And because the seeds do not get destroyed because there's no heat. And then, you will have more mites. You probably will still have pests too in the worm bin. So that would be a difference. But worm compost is supposedly very microbially diverse. So it's got its benefits. So you only need a square foot of space plus the height and the feedstocks. Another thing about worms, like with hot piles, greens and browns, anything that was once alive, it's now dead, you can put it in a hot compost pile, in theory. Now, following organic program standards, there's some things you can't put in. You shouldn't put in carnivore waste, and you shouldn't put in human waste or biosolids, or maybe even dead animals. Like if you're feeding food to people on a farm, there are some things you just should not, and you're not allowed to put in your compost pile. But with worms, there's just some things you can't put in there because it's not good for the worms. So we like to feed our worms a vegan diet. It's possible in nature, an animal dies, falls on the ground, and maybe there's worms in that general area, and maybe they eventually go into that space. But I've put meat products, cheese products in a worm bin in the past, and my worms looked like a string of pearls. I did not show it on here, but you can Google it. And I need to read more about it, but I think they get protein poisoning if they have no other option. So this was an above ground worm bin, and they're surrounded by this cheese that I accidentally put in my worm bin, and a lot of them died. So I would not recommend it. I would recommend vegan food scraps, and if you can, raw, pre-processed. So it's like before they're cooked food scraps. You can put some cooked stuff too, but I wouldn't put a lot of it. And because that could also attract rats, and rats already will eat your worms, but you put some cooked foods, and maybe it could get worse. Maybe you'll attract black soldier flies. Maybe you don't want those in your worm bin. But then the other thing, you also always want to bury the greens. And that's in any pile, but especially a worm bin where, with a hot pile, you have to add everything at once. In a worm bin, you can add scraps every day on a daily basis. You don't have to add all the materials and build the pile at once and let it sit because it's not a heat-treated process. So you kind of dig into the brown material of a worm bin, like put that watermelon rind in the center and then cover it back up if you're doing a small scale. Larger scale, you'll be a little more systematic about it. Another thing, worms are cool. Yes, they're not just interesting and fun, they're also need to be kept cool. So you don't put them in the sun. If you can keep them indoors, do so. They need to be between 55 and 85 degrees, the temperatures that you would feel comfortable in. They could be very little work. The thing is, the smaller the scraps that you're putting in there, the better. But that's with most forms of composting. You don't really want to put large pieces, except for with animal composting. Yes, you can compost an animal, and those you can just put the whole animal in. But that's a different quality of compost. You're making some good stuff here. So that you would want to put on your food. So chop the pieces up smaller. The worms will be able to process them quicker. Okay, and the product, you could sell worms and you get this amazing plant amendment. And all you need is a worm bin, because you have to have a way to collect the poop and to have it all together in somewhere. And you don't have to buy a bin, you can make one. So I have a lot of experience. I volunteered at a worm farm for 4 years, and so I like the in-ground worm bins. They're so easy. You just chop your food scraps, throw them in. You collect them on the counter for a few days if you're just doing an at-home system. Even a large 4-foot by 8-foot farm system. Break down those scraps, put them in, cover them with browns so that you're not attracting like flies to lay eggs. And just put them in there. The worms sometimes will even come to you if you don't want to buy them. And this is my favorite worm bin on the left. It's an in-ground worm bin made of a milk crate. We've been using wooden orange produce crates lately though. And you do want to use hardware cloth over all corners and parts of the bin. Not the top wooden part, but anywhere underground, because rats tend to tunnel like an inch or two deep, and they'll chew through the plastic to get in, or they'll get through those holes in the milk crate. And then the rats eat your worms. So we like to add some metal to keep them out. That's the best worm bin, I think, because it's more vegan friendly. But then there's other worm bins. You can keep them in the house. I recommend worm bins that allow for drainage, and ones that don't or have a very small drainage catchment section, the water will spill over onto your counter. So on the left, the tote, it has an entire tote with like 2 or 3 inches of space to catch water, and it's not leaking out. You know, you can empty that once a month and you'll be good, or once a week. And then the one on the upper right-hand corner, you know, you can use that little spigot and drain out the liquid. And then the one on the bottom, it's such a beautiful bin. It's made of wood, and it is a stacking bin. So that it's got that going for it. But I've used it, and the liquid did drain out on my countertop. And then these are all worm bins I've used too. They are made of plastic, so that's a little bit of a minus. The one on the right, the stacking one, the cool thing about those is the lowest tray, you know, worms will be in, you'll fill just the first tray with food scraps, and you put your worms in there. And then after they've processed most of them, you put the bedding and food scraps in the next tray, and then they'll self-sort. They'll crawl out of their poop and head towards the food. And then you don't have to sort the worms. With some of these other systems that we saw on the last page, you actually, in the bin on the left, you actually have to sort the worms and try to get them out of there. That's the downside of that worm bin. And then I just like the fact that the stacking tray one has a flat top. I feel like it could be a great like side table. You could put a lamp on that. But the two on the left, I would say the PVC that's holding that bag up, it usually gets pretty weak, and I've had one collapse under the weight of the worm castings, which can be like in that bag 150, 180 pounds. And that PVC just doesn't seem, in my experience, to hold up to that weight. And also, like anything plastic, you put it in the sun. Like this looks like a trash can, like you could just keep it outside, but you put that in the sunlight and those worms are going to cook in there. And then the smells just accelerate, and I'm just not a big fan of that. So I'm still loving the in-ground worm bin. I've also worked with this one. It's called the Worm Wigwam, and it also got pretty hot. And but it had a really cool harvest bar, so it was a little bit less work to harvest the worm castings. But otherwise, I still love the in-ground worm bin, even on a large scale. I haven't tried it yet, but I really want to. And then, some people even make worm bins in windrows, like on the ground, maybe held up or held in a wooden, um, like a wooden containment of some sort. So that's Zach of Arizona Worm Farm, and he's showing you his worm wedge method, where you add organic mat or add some bedding and some food, and add some bedding and some food, and the worms will keep crawling towards the bedding and the food as you keep adding it, and you might add it from left to right. So you don't necessarily have to have a bin. This whole pile can become worm castings in theory. So, but I think the worm bin is very helpful though. So some other types of composting or methods where they eventually lead to compost include bokashi. So here's a video of somebody just using a regular 5-gallon bucket. It's actually the Epic Gardener, and he's showing you how to make bokashi. He's putting a bokashi bran on the bottom of his bucket. He's adding more than I think is necessary, though. And that bran is inoculated with lactobacillus, the same stuff that's in yogurt. And it kind of ferments your food scraps, so they just smell like pickles. So you add like 2 inches of food scraps, and then I would say a small handful of bran, smaller than that cup, and then 2 inches of food scraps and a small handful of bran. And the benefit of this is that you can keep it in your, maybe under your sink, and it's a way to like keep collecting food scraps without having, like, for a month or so, without having to do anything with them right away necessarily. Like if you don't have a worm bin, if you don't have a soil to put your food scraps in, if you don't have the space to compost, you can start pre-composting in your house without it smelling like death. And that's what I love about this system. And then when you are ready to compost, you can put this stuff in a compost pile. You can donate it to a community garden. What else? Some people even feed it to animals if it's high quality stuff, if it's not moldy. But I think you got to do a little more research on that one. Now, the one thing I'll say here is that would be useful is he didn't add browns to the bottom of his bin. And I don't know if I explained this yet, but greens are fresh living material, like green plants, green leaves, fresh flowers, even a roadkill, that's been freshly killed and it's not crunchy yet. That's all what we call greens, and they really get the decomposition process going. And then we have browns, dead plant material. So if you saw plants in the ground that died, a tumbleweed, a yellow tumbleweed blowing across in the wind, or if you see flowers and then they died and you're like, wow, that's a crunchy yellow sunflower now, and the stalk is yellow or like a whitish color. Dead grasses that you see on hills. Brown leaves, like leaves that turn orange and fall to the ground and they turn brown and then they get crunchy. Wood chips, wood shavings, sawdust. Those are all brown materials. And brown materials, sorry, that was a long explanation, but the brown materials should be added to the bottom of the bokashi bucket to absorb all the juices that are going to come out of the food scraps above. So just fill your bucket a quarter of the way with brown materials when you start so that they can absorb all the juice that's going to accumulate out of those food scraps, and that'll make the process a little bit less smelly. And so a common one for people who don't have yard waste is paper shredding. So you can get them from your office, or if you have your own papers to shred, onion peels. Um, those are some good ones. So when should you make bokashi? If you have limited access to browns, maybe you just have paper shreds, and maybe you need to compost meats or processed salty foods. So worms, you don't want to put meat or processed foods so much in a worm bin. But like if you can't make a hot compost pile, or you just don't have a ton of material that would be needed for a hot compost pile, you could do this little bokashi method. Um, like, let's see, you will need to find somewhere to put it after you have pickled your food scraps, though, or fermented them. So that's something to consider. You could donate them to your neighbor. You could find a place to bury them, donate them to your community garden. Or if you make them very carefully, but you can't compost just anything in that case, you could feed them to animals. So like you could mix bokashi with some veggie scraps for like a week and then feed it to your chickens, or but you'll have to research that more. I don't get into that because I have not done it yet. Um, but it has the products that you can get out of it include a pre-compost. The juice is a great drain cleaner, and you can inoculate a compost pile with it too. So you could put that stuff in the center of a compost pile, get really hot, and does not take a long time. And it's great for people who hate bugs, but they don't mind the smell of pickles. And so you need an airtight container, like a 5-gallon bucket. You could buy the bokashi bin, but they're expensive. And you need some bran. You can make the bran yourself. It is a process, but if you don't want to buy the bran, you can make it. So there's some example of, add your food scraps, add your bran, wait 1 to 2 weeks after the bucket's full, and then you can bury it and grow things in it after another 2 weeks. So then there's the black soldier fly larvae. That's what they look like in the right-hand corner of the screen. You can also use them if you want to compost meat or process salty foods. And I guess they make compost, but I put them in this category because I don't know too much about their manures. But almost all compost really is bug manure and the waste products of microorganisms. So maybe these should have been put in that first category of composting. But these guys will eat anything. I don't know if they'll be healthy eating anything, but they definitely will. And something really cool about them, jumping to products, is that they're high in calcium and protein, so they're great food for chickens, reptiles, and fish. And so you're turning your food waste into another product that you could either use yourself, or you could even sell them. Like, these things go for a good price. So when might you want to compost with them? You've got the processed salty foods, or not. You have space outdoors. Most people don't want to bring them indoors, but large scale facilities do. But you might want to do this outdoors because that's how you attract the flies. They're outside. And so I don't buy them. I just put the food scraps in the bin, and then I wait for them to come to me. And I would put them in the shade. Like, living things don't want to be in a hot plastic box in the sun. And it's really very low effort. You just throw your food scraps in. Always put browns on top of your fresh greens. And then if you build like a special bin, they'll crawl out of the bin themselves. You'll see the bin on the right, and they actually crawl up the tubes, and the larvae will fall into the bucket. So you can just take the bucket and throw it to your chickens. And then we're playing a video on the right. Somebody, you're seeing getting a little tour. This is like a cribs tour. This is the crib of a black soldier fly larvae and how to make it. Okay. So it takes a little time, but pretty simple after you've got the bin. Dehydrator grinders. How to compost with a mill
You've got about
food
6
recycler.
liters of
I actually
nutrient-rich,
left
shelf-stable
the
food
volume on
grounds.
here.
And here's where your 1, 2, 3 come in. First, you just pour food grounds into your compost and mix it together. Then you water it with a garden hose. Ideally, you want it about as wet as your wrung-out kitchen sponge. And the third step? Once you have enough raw material, you just wait. For real. Just come back every week or so.
Okay. So that was the mill. There's mills, there's Lomies, there's others. Restaurants even have large scale versions of this. It dehydrates the food scraps and then grinds them. And so it's kind of like bokashi. You're not fully composting the food scraps, you're preserving them so that you can compost them at a later time. And all microorganisms do need water. So I would think, in order for them to decompose, they need to be rehydrated eventually. This is a good way to store them until you do that. So when might you use these? If you're a restaurant and you want to start composting your food waste and you want to have a way to hold it and transport it easily and like maybe donate it to a community garden. Or like if you are a farm or a community garden, you might want to accept this type of waste from a restaurant. Like maybe you can partner up somehow. And that's a way for them to reduce organics to the landfill, but also create a food product for your microorganisms. But the thing is, the dehydrators are a little bit expensive. And so that's kind of like you have to do a cost benefit analysis to see if that makes sense for you. So let's see. If you have limited access to brown feedstocks and you need to process compost processed foods or meat foods, just like the bokashi, this has the same benefits, except that it doesn't smell like pickles. It actually smells like a soup spice, so it smells fabulous. And it's a good method if you also detest bugs. You cannot touch a worm. Okay, and then there's the lasagna composting, sheet mulching. Some people will call it hugelkultur. They're all similar versions of the same thing where you layer different types of materials, green materials, brown materials. You can layer them underground. You can layer them above ground. Oftentimes people plant into them. Hugelkulturs involve more wood. Lasagna composting might be like more smaller green and brown materials that will decompose a little bit faster. But basically, you're composting in place is the idea. And sometimes, like if you use wood and you bury them deep, they'll really absorb water pretty well. In Southern California, it might make more sense to do an in-ground pit hugelkultur type. And then places where it's super rainy with clay soils might make sense to do it above ground in a mound. So if you have access to a lot of yard waste, sticks and logs, at least at one time, maybe you got a chip drop, but then you also have a large amount of soil that you can put over the top because you're gonna need probably like 12 inches of soil. So if you were gonna do raised beds, this isn't a similar option, but you're really composting in place. And so it will be a large investment up front, as many of these are, but over time, it'll pay it back. And I accidentally added a few slides that I didn't mean to. Okay, and then composting and compost use policy resources. So I didn't talk a lot about policy because I actually have a lot to learn about the National Organic Program standards, but I was checking the EPA website, and here are some. Maybe just check the EPA website, check CDFA, check Cal Recycle, FDA, and probably ILSR, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and even CAF, Community Association of Family Farmers, and you'll find a lot of, ATTRA, ATTRA. You'll find some information you need. And of course, the NOP manual online would be a great thing to check out. I don't know that I have that on here, but okay, so thank you so much I don't think I have to thank you. just a black screen. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope that you learned something about composting, and add any questions in the chat in the comment section. Thank you. Bye.